What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I just wanted to give some early thoughts. The fight's not for another couple months, but I wanted to give some early thoughts on the upcoming WBA, IBF, and WBO title fight between champion Anthony Joshua and challenger Oleksandr Usyk, who is the former undisputed champion, just a division below at cruiserweight, which is kind of sandwiched between light heavyweight and heavyweight, or light heavyweight, bridgerweight, the new division that they created, and then heavyweight. So Oleksandr Usyk basically dominated the cruiserweight division, won all of the major belts, and then went up to heavyweight. He has had 2 fights since against old, over-the-hill journeyman Chaz Witherspoon, and then against, somebody who gives a lot of people a very difficult fight, Derek Chisora, who records-wise is kind of a win-some, lose-some guy, but when you look at the quality of opponent, fight after fight after fight, and then you go back and watch those fights, you'll see that Derek Chisora is a lot better of a fighter than his record indicates, but it is what it is. So those are Oleksandr Usyk's 2 heavyweight fights since jumping from cruiser. So Usyk has been Anthony Joshua's WBO mandatory challenger for a while, but they were pretty much trying to gear up for a super fight between WBC champ Tyson Fury, who holds the only belt that Anthony Joshua does not have, and Anthony Joshua. Fury versus Joshua would have been huge, but Deontay Wilder had some legal clauses that worked in his favor that triggered a trilogy fight that was just postponed, but it's supposed to happen between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. Basically, Fury versus Wilder 3 is going to happen instead of Fury versus Joshua, so Joshua will instead defend his 3 belts against Oleksandr Usyk, still currently undefeated. So my early thoughts on this fight have been, one, the size gap. And I know that's an obvious one, and it's sometimes an overrated issue to even discuss, but it's too immense to really ignore here. And yes, Usyk is 6'3", AJ 6'6". Reach-wise, AJ has an 82-inch reach compared with Oleksandr Usyk's 78-inch reach. So there is that. I get the idea that Oleksandr Usyk is the greater technical fighter. I mean, both of these guys, AJ and Usyk, are Olympic gold medalists. They both won their gold in 2012 in London. AJ fighting at super heavyweight and Usyk regular heavyweight. This is orthodox AJ versus southpaw Usyk. And a lot of people, who have seen AJ take his one loss versus Andy Ruiz, when Andy Ruiz was a kind of a late replacement for Jarrell Big Baby Miller. Andy Ruiz famously pulled off the huge upset, knocked AJ down 4 times and TKO'd him. Shocking upset victory. I mean, it damaged the long anticipated plans between Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, because that was really the heavyweight fight that everybody wanted to see, because they were both undefeated and they were both knocking all of their opponents out. I know that Stavern carried Wilder the distance the first time, and Joseph Parker took AJ the distance when they fought, but that was really the fight to make, and it would have been super exciting and lucrative, but it didn't happen. AJ got upset versus Andy Ruiz, ended up avenging that via decision, switched up his game plan, was moving around the ring more, and was operating behind a jab. Deontay Wilder, had that draw with Tyson Fury, very dramatic and controversial draw decision, and then in the rematch, Fury pretty much obliterated Wilder, and now, again, they're gearing up for their 3rd fight. Now, another thing about Joshua versus Usyk that's jumping out at me is the fact that Usyk is now like 34 years old. And yes, he is still currently undefeated. And if you watch his fights, even just a few years back when he was in that World Boxing Super Series that included, I believe Marco Huck, Maris Briedis, Murat Gassiev, and others, when he was involved in that, you look at the way that he moves his feet around the ring, and if you look at his last 2 fights, to me, he's not nearly as mobile as he was when he was, late 20s, early 30s. Now, the drop-off in mobility, in my opinion, even if it's slight, could be attributed to him now carrying about 15 to 20 additional pounds, if not more, basically sacrificing a little bit of mobility so that you could properly acclimate into the heavyweight division. I could see that, but at the same time, what you are then losing is what would really serve you well against a guy like Anthony Joshua. Now, I don't think that Usyk's somewhat reduced mobility is strictly because he's got the additional weight. I do think that age is also a component here. And as I'm looking closer at this matchup, and I will do a proper preview where I do a deeper dive in analyzing this matchup, but when I look at it at first glance, I want to first be clear on how tremendously accomplished Oleksandr Usyk is. Because the thing is, the cruiserweight division, because it's kind of sandwiched between light heavy and heavy, and at least from an American standpoint, it usually features a lot of, super talented people with names that most Americans can't pronounce from parts of the world that they couldn't point to on a map. The cruiserweight often gets lost in the, casual boxing consciousness. So even though Usyk was running roughshod over the division, he was largely flying under the radar to a lot of boxing fans. But if you look closely at his resume, he gave Krzysztof Glowacki his first loss. Yes, Glowacki just recently lost to Okoli, who's on the rise in the cruiserweight division. But for a long time, Glowacki's only loss was to Oleksandr Usyk. Michael Hunter, who right now is a top 10 heavyweight contender, Michael Hunter's first and only loss is to Oleksandr Usyk. So Usyk has taken away Glowacki's 0 in the loss column and Michael Hunter's 0 in the loss column. Not only that, but Murat Gassiev's only loss is to Oleksandr Usyk. Till this day, again, only loss to Usyk. Same thing with Maris Briedis. Maris Briedis, to this day, only has one loss, and it's to Oleksandr Usyk. That is something that needs to be considered and reconsidered when you look at somebody's resume, who they've beaten, and what those guys that they've beaten have done with their other opponents. Oleksandr Usyk is very special in that regard. So he's now at heavyweight. I do think he's a little slower, and I do think that that's going to impact him big time against a guy like Anthony Joshua. So Joshua, when I saw him, really coming up and starting to get famous, kind of building a name before he was really beating the really good fighters. So this would be around the time that he beat Dillian Whyte a few years ago. So this would be, for instance, before his breakthrough performance against Vladimir Klitschko that really put him on the map, right? And so this would obviously be before he beat Joseph Parker, Alexander Povetkin. So when I saw this muscle-bound, very good-looking dude, Anthony Joshua, start, racking up these knockouts and improving his record against, lesser-tiered fighters, I'm thinking, okay, this guy is not... There's no way that this guy is that damn good. First of all, I usually am very skeptical when somebody's a very tall, boxer. So he was 6'6" at the time, which now, yes, you have Wilder at 6'7", Fury at 6'9". You've got a lot of big and tall fighters today, Joe Joyce. But I'm like, there's no way that somebody this muscular, this, good looking just in the face. Boxing isn't necessarily a beauty pageant, right? Look, you have exceptions, Cassius Clay, Oscar De La Hoya, and so forth. But, I just think that rare is the case that somebody who's this just blessed with the natural muscle build, this guy just naturally shreds muscularly, right? Whether he's hitting the weight room or not, that somebody who's built like this with that type of frame and those types of looks, there's no way that he could also be the most skilled boxer. Just the lottery and the odds of that happening are too small to really believe that it is the case. Usually these hype trains will bust before they prove greatness, right? I've obviously been wrong about AJ. It turns out, yes, he is pretty special. How special? Well, the story's still being written, but he has already accomplished a whole hell of a lot. He avenged his loss to Andy Ruiz. Yes, it was via somewhat, less impressive decision. He didn't take Ruiz's head off the same way that he takes other people's heads off, but he won the fight, so that's another win against another very quality fighter, and he's got several of those now. He's still one of only 2 people to beat Joseph Parker, for instance. But matchups-wise, I do see the red flags that other people, are putting out there. From online boxing critics, I watch Richard Dwyer, for instance. He's very bullish on Usyk, and he thinks that Usyk is going to get the jump on Anthony Joshua here. Now, in terms of the styles making fights, I get what he's seeing. But what I would counter with is, if AJ, style and build-wise and boxing skill set-wise, is a little akin to Vladimir Klitschko, the younger of the two great Klitschko brothers. If that is the case, where it's not a super mobile fighter, somebody who works behind a jab and is really looking to land the 1-2 and a left hook, if that is Joshua's basic set of skills, and that's what he's relying so heavily on, I can see where you could see a craftsman, a southpaw, clever, super accomplished, super experienced, and has never lost, Oleksandr Usyk, being a matchup nightmare for a guy and somebody who could very well just take round after round after round on the judges' scorecards against somebody who is as knockout and heavy hitting reliant as Anthony Joshua. Andy Ruiz rematch aside, I can see the red flags. But also, if you look closely at the matchup and look at Usyk's age and look at him putting on more weight than he was normally used to carrying when he was dominating at cruiserweight, I could also see this playing out potentially like Vladimir Klitschko, and I'm throwing an older reference here, versus Chris Byrd. This was several years ago. This was probably in the late aughts, maybe 2007 or 2006. Yeah, it was 2006. Damn, good guess. This was another smaller heavyweight, Chris Byrd, super skilled. Granted, he was 6 feet tall and not 6'3" like Usyk, but he was a southpaw, and he, was beating other very good heavyweights. He beat prime David Tua. He beat Evander Holyfield. But when Vladimir Klitschko versus Chris Byrd 2, they had fought several years back, and Vladimir had won that via decision. But in this rematch in 2006, the bludgeoning behind the jab and the right and the straight right hand that Klitschko was administering to Chris Byrd was something truly to behold. This was one of the worst beatings. It ended up just getting very tough to watch. And he stopped Chris Byrd, just pummeled him. And I'm thinking, if Oleksandr Usyk isn't able to control the pace and kind of, pressure AJ with skilled and intelligent pressure, basically coming in, behind a jab and through certain angles that AJ's not used to seeing, and just being a puzzle that AJ can't solve, if Usyk isn't able to do that as effectively as he wants to, and he ends up kind of getting caught standing outside and his legs start to feel heavy because the jab is starting to take a toll, and this ends up being a thing where he's starting to show less of his head movement. Because again, if you look at his prime, I'm talking prime Usyk a few years ago in that World Boxing Super Series, if you look at his head movement and the way that he's entering the pocket, it requires a certain amount of athleticism and energy, especially as you get into the middle rounds, that I don't think he'll necessarily have right now, today, in a fight against Anthony Joshua. So if he is a little less mobile and he's not moving in the same way, this could end up being a very rough night for Usyk. And he could end up being at the end of a jab, because another thing about Anthony Joshua, his jab has been developing rapidly. We didn't see that jab that he showed against Andy Ruiz in their rematch earlier in AJ's career. So I think that he's developing new skills. He knows the type of challenge that he's up against. Again, these guys were in the same Olympic class, different divisions, but same year. So Anthony Joshua is very aware of what the task is at hand here. And I think that he's going to understand that there's a tremendous value to a jab if he could keep that thing pumping and keep controlling the space and the distance. And again, I don't think that going into the middle rounds, it's going to be AJ that's fading. I think that it's going to be Usyk that's fading because of the effectiveness of AJ's jab. Now, granted, AJ doesn't go to the body a ton, so I don't think that there's going to be a tremendous worry for Usyk in that regard. But I don't expect Usyk to do a whole lot of body work on AJ as well. I think this is going to be a bit of a chess match. I just don't think that we are really considering how much AJ is improving in the sweet science aspects of boxing. He's not just a muscle-bound knockout artist anymore, even if you thought that's what he was 5 years ago. So, early thoughts? I'm kind of getting Vladimir Klitschko versus Chris Byrd 2 vibes here. I'm going to take another look at this as we approach the fight date. Again, it's a couple months away. But this is a very intriguing matchup. It is very dangerous. I mean, if Anthony Joshua had his druthers, I'm sure he would not want this fight to necessarily be scheduled, because it is super high risk, and Usyk is one of the guys who the boxing hipsters can dig, you know what I mean? Like the people who are in the know, they're like, they'll name drop Oleksandr Usyk. But what's it going to do for AJ in terms of the casual boxing fan discussion? This isn't Deontay Wilder. It's obviously not Tyson Fury. It's not even Dillian White, who's probably also more popular just overall than Oleksandr Usyk. So again, high risk. And it is a high reward in terms of what it means to AJ's resume if he could beat somebody as great and accomplished as Oleksandr Usyk. And there have been great cruiserweights turned heavyweights in the past, Evander Holyfield being one of them. I just think that in this case, given the age, given the size gap, given the skill sets relative to one another, I think that this is a very bad matchup for Oleksandr Usyk, even though on paper, you might look at this and say, hey, this is a trap fight. In college football, they call these games trap games, where it could be like a road game against a much lesser team, sandwiched between two very important games that you get up for. And that little game that's sandwiched between the two that on paper you should win ends up being the game that you lose. This looks like, of course, it could be a trap fight against Joshua, although, Oleksandr Usyk is way too esteemed and credentialed to be looked at as somebody who you overlook. You don't overlook Oleksandr Usyk. Casual boxing fans might not know the name, but the fighters do. So I expect AJ to come into this fight with a game plan that's going to make Usyk kind of look his age a bit. So if I had to just, from the gut, early prediction, I would say AJ via pretty clear, competitive, but pretty clear decision. I don't necessarily think that he's going to get Usyk out of there, but I think that Usyk will, at a point, stop pursuing as heavily and will not be able to utilize the utilities and the tools that we've seen him deploy over the years as effectively as you get into the middle and late rounds against a guy like AJ. I do think that Usyk is going to get thumped multiple times, but more so controlled by a jab. It might sound crazy, but these are just my early thoughts. We'll give it another look as we approach the fight date. But please, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of this matchup between Anthony Joshua and Oleksandr Usyk? The stakes are super high because a lot of people are, again, kind of looking past this and saying, okay, when are we going to get AJ versus Fury? But there is still a lot of fighting to be had, apparently, before we get to that point. And I do think that Anthony Joshua, matchups-wise, does have his hands full. But let me hear from you, please. Leave your comments in the comments. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.